Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy. Great. Well, Joe, hello. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Good. My guest today is Joe Mastey, who is currently a lead engineer at Home Chef. Before that, you were a manager, senior manager, manager of internal learning at Enova. So you worked in a lot of roles there, and you've also done technical consulting in the past in the kind of the apprenticeship and the onboarding space for companies in the Chicagoland area, and then also spoke at a whole slew of conferences. Have I missed anything, or is that sum it up?
That's about right. That's about right.
Cool. Great. Can you share a little bit about your current company, Home Chef, and kind of your role there?
Sure. Yeah. So Home Chef, it's funny. This is the first time I've worked for a company that has like a physical good that we ship. We ship boxes of food to people, sort of like Freshly or HelloFresh, Blue Apron, those kind of things. I'm a lead engineer there. I run two teams. One of them is our internal apps team, so taking care of like customer service, our culinary team, that kind of stuff. And the other team is our retail. We're owned by Kroger, so we have our stuff in 3,000 stores. And you can imagine the logistics around that kind of stuff takes some support. So,
sure. That's great. Can you share a little bit about the tech stack there?
Yeah, it's kind of your normal Rails, React, Postgres, RSpec, kind of the thing. A lot of companies in the Rails space, I think, have like pretty much identical stacks.
Yeah, sure. Cool. And when you say lead, like an engineering lead, you're leading two teams. Do you mean actually like managing those individuals too, or more leading from like an engineering perspective? Maybe someone else is doing the management.
Yeah, I like that question. I am not anyone's formal manager, which is kind of what I was looking for in this role. I lead them in a technical sense, like figuring out project stuff. And, there's a lot of informal mentorship, informal authority, that kind of thing. And then I also have kind of more of a view across the department on, stuff like our CI runtime and our deployment scripts and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Nice. Great. Can you share a little bit about your pathway into technology? Were you a traditional computer science graduate, more self-taught, somewhere in between?
Yeah. No, I was a CS graduate, which feels like really archaic these days. I feel like everybody came through boot camp. I kind of wish they existed back when I was learning. But yeah, I got a CS degree. Actually started programming professionally in my freshman year in CS. Convinced somebody somehow that they should pay me money. I've been at it for 18 years now. So
nice.
Long time.
That's awesome.
I'm old.
What's funny is, so I the first I worked at a coding boot camp for a number of years, and I actually spoke with a consultant who we brought on who had worked with coding boot camps over the years. And I said, I didn't know there was coding boot camps before Dev Boot Camp and this kind of more recent wave. And he said, there's always been coding boot camps as long as there was coding, right? He's like, you just don't hear about them because they popped up, they trained a whole bunch of people, and then they shut down, right? And he's like, pre.com boom, you had a ton of coding boot camps that now all those folks are 20 plus years into their career, and they just take it off their resume, right? So you see these guys that don't have necessarily any type of computer science background. You're like, how'd they get into it? And they might tell you, I did a little training on the side, and maybe not say, it was, whatever the Dev Boot Camp of 1999 was.
Of yesteryear. Yeah. No, that's cool. That's really cool. And I mean, it's cool that you can do that and be like completely fantastic at what we do. Like, it's funny. I don't usually end up using my like formal CS education very much. So
yeah. What was how'd you land your first engineering job?
So those, I would say that those were like little, I wouldn't even consider them a job. I'd say my first real engineering job was an internship, like a couple years in. I was working actually for the Chicago Public Library, which has like 110 branches or something. So, you can imagine there's actually a surprising amount internal tooling that gets built. Yeah, so intern. They hired me after I graduated too, so it ended up being my first real job too.
Nice. So kind of transition in. That's great. I think it's you say like, kind of little jobs. I think that's something that's often overlooked too. If you can afford to do it, I think it's an easier way into technology a lot of times. Like, can I take this smaller part-time thing, at least get something on the resume, and then, maybe it becomes a full-time thing later on, or at least it's something, right? That says someone has paid me to do this, even if it was, $12 an hour.
Yeah, no, it's just like it's like a degree. The entire thing is proof. When you're, getting hired as a developer, they want to know that somebody's taken that. I was selling refrigerators and like programming in my like free time while I went to college.
I love it. It's funny. I think I had someone who started, they were doing Cutco knife sales. They told the story recently on the show as they were learning to code. It's kind of interesting.
Whatever pays the rent, right?
Yeah. Right. Great. And then how'd you end up at Home Chef, kind of this last transition here?
Yeah, I was running my own company remotely, doing code, as you said, helping companies with the onboarding and apprenticeship stuff. Worked at home by myself for like 2 years essentially, and then I said I really want to work in an office environment and actually talk to people in person. So I did that. COVID happened, and here I am back by myself. But I enjoy working with teams. I enjoy working on one consistent company. Like, there's something to be said for consulting, and there's something to be said for kind of being in-house product side. They're both fun.
Can you share? I find your background really interesting and kind of a unique skill set of working at Enova. And this is my understanding. You worked at Enova, kind of helped build this internal training program, right? To get people like when they were onboarded, not necessarily from a Ruby tech stack, right? You could help them try to get ramped up as quickly as possible. And then I think after doing that for several years, you thought, like, is there a way to do this, at scale, or at least help other companies do the same type of thing?
Yeah. I was really fortunate to get to sort of invent the job and get my boss to give me that job that I had invented. I think at the time, the engineering team had been growing pretty quickly. For an engineering team that was like 80 folks, bringing on like 4 or 5 folks every couple of weeks is, very disruptive. New employees are super disruptive. Yeah, right. So my pitch was that I can get all those folks in, not disrupt the teams, and bring them and the rest of the team up to a higher standard, a higher level of the coding that we're doing. And then having done that, especially with some new grads, I'm like, all right, well, I had one candidate who came from our call center back then, and she interviewed. And she bombed because she was trying to like learn in her free time. She had like 4 kids. And I'm like, no, but this is the person that I want on my team. So give me this person, and I'm going to turn them into somebody you really want in your team. And that's what got me into apprenticeship. And then, a little while later, I decided it was kind of, time to move on. But like, I care very deeply about helping people get into the industry. And so that was sort of my start in trying to get people to do apprenticeship programs and be able to hire more junior folk.
Yeah, I think there's at Enova in particular that program was kind of long lasting, and I had worked with them in the past as a recruiter. I think I saw at least 4 or 5 people that I had worked with that landed there that went from maybe non-Ruby tech stacks, or maybe tech stacks that feel a little bit outdated or maybe aren't as popular, into this role, right? And I think that's something that's really helpful that was more like senior level folks, but especially being able to take on more early career individuals is huge, right? Especially it opens up, kind of changes how you can hire, right? Because you're not trying to compete with the same 50 engineers who are looking at any given time that everyone else is, right?
Yeah. It's funny, right? Like if you're more junior and you've been job searching, I'm sure you've heard the story all the time of like, oh, we just need senior people. We just like, there's just right now, we only need senior people. And those folks are wrong. They could handle more junior folks. I just think a lot of them don't understand how. So it's nice to be able to kind of like broaden that and be like, no, you can you don't need like 8 years of experience for the work that you're doing. Like
Yeah.
we can get you something easier.
Yeah. Well, it's funny to me too, having been at now a couple companies that it's really interesting to see how much of an emphasis there is on like helping get people up to speed versus like, yeah, you'll
Mm.
figure it out as you get along. And I feel like the difference is often like, okay, am I not productive for 3 weeks, like 3 months,
Hmm.
or like 6 months, right? And if
Hmm.
it's three
Yeah,
weeks, it's like great. Like that was a really great onboarding program, and I actually feel
sure.
like I'm, hitting the ground running. 3 months, it's okay, right? Maybe it's a little bit more complicated, but six
Yeah,
months, we just finally feel like you're getting into it. That's like,
yeah.
whew, that's a lot, right?
That sounds really dispiriting, right? Like that just sounds that would feel rough to me.
Yeah,
I can't imagine.
yeah, it's
I'm
kind of
fortunate
interesting.
not to be in that situation, thankfully. But yeah.
Yeah, well, have you? I'm curious. Do you do technical interviews currently at Home Chef? Are you involved in that process?
Yeah, so I'm in the hiring process. I do more culture interviews than I do technicals. Just scheduling wise, it's a little bit easier for me. But yeah, I've delivered a handful of them recently.
Nice. And what are you typically evaluating for when you're looking for, I guess, maybe at Home Chef and in the past when you're evaluating someone from a
Mhm.
technical perspective for your team?
Well, sort of, almost like an aside. There's in software we try to like always reinvent the wheel because that's what we do compulsively. But there's actually like 100 years of research into what makes a good hiring experience and what's
Sure.
effective, and like what turns out to be scientifically effective is essentially do the work. The best way to prove that somebody can do the work is to do the work.
Hmm.
And so we have an interview question that is essentially here's a repo with some amount of code. We're going to go through and solve a bug, or we're going to go through and add a small feature. And so I guess in one sense the answer is can they do the work? And in another sense, there's a huge amount which is attitude, and how they approach problems, how they work with other people, how they communicate, which I would say is probably equally important to the other bit. I can help you raise the sort of technical bar if you're struggling a little bit. It's really hard to raise this other bar on how you interact with other people. I can't really train you on that.
Yeah, well, and it's such a tough thing to coach around, right? Especially if I feel like the
Right.
later in someone's career there, the less likely they are to change their whole mentality around communication,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. For
Yeah,
sure. For sure.
yeah, it's interesting. Do you have you said this kind of do the work philosophy? Do you have a
Mhm.
standardized system or a process that you use currently to basically evaluate
Yeah.
people?
Yeah. I mean, we have a standard interview question. So it's we primarily hire just sort of full stack developers. So
Mhm.
in the past, I've been at places that hire like separate DBAs and QA folk and and developers and front end people. In this place, it's primarily full stack, so it's pretty much the same code base, same question. I think we technically have two questions, one like a little more front endy. Um, the sort of like grading, I would say, is not super standardized.
Mm.
It should be, but it's not. But that's the reality.
Yeah. What's that process look like? Is it I'm assuming some type of phone call first, and then
Mhm.
what's after that?
Yeah. So in these days of literally everyone being remote to their jobs, it is essentially usually two folks from our team, one more junior, one more senior, and
Mhm.
then on a remote call like this, and we use I forget the name of a piece of software that lets you kind of share a keyboard, and it
Yeah.
runs on we have like an interview laptop that we kind of all remote into to deal with.
Nice. That's great. So is
Yeah.
that's the technical portion?
That's the technical portion. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
it's like it's a 90-minute interview. Everyone remotes in, chat a little, kind of walk through this ticket, ask questions, see if you can solve it. We don't expect that everyone's going to get all the way through, but it's nice to sort of approach the same problem to be able to compare people a little bit more evenly, fairly.
Yeah. Nice. And then is there some type of final after that, or is that kind of the process?
Yeah, we do not do a second one. We don't do homework right now. I think that question it covers a lot of the same ground that most people's homework, most companies' homework problems do. So there's a final with leadership kind of interview, but we're shorter rounds. I get the sense a lot of people are shorter rounds nowadays because of the market being what it is.
So I think if you're still putting people through 5-6 rounds and they got to meet with so and so and so and so and so and so,
Yeah.
I think it's just they're going to disappear by the time you get there. Even early career folks, I think are like, oh, if you need me to have 6 conversations, like what were the first 3 for, right? Like, why do you need me to meet with more people?
And I hear people now just like rejecting homework. They're like, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
So like, wow, that's great from a employee standpoint. From an employer standpoint, I'm like, ow. But it's kind of neat to see how those are changing.
Well, it is interesting. There's this kind of consistently you see 2 mindsets. Having done the show for a while now, it's either traditional leak code whiteboarding style interview question, right? Which the idea is, well, everyone's giving it at the same time, and these types of questions are out there, so you could study for them, right? Or it's that's bullshit and it's not actually applicable to the job. So we do a homework style, like build something for us, and you can do it on your own time, right? And they both. And I think that the flip side to that is like, but the thing you think takes 2 hours probably actually takes someone 6 hours, and then you're asking for you
have to control for that for sure. Yeah. For sure. The leak code, the algorithmic stuff though, right? Like this is in this 100-year-old research, not effective.
Yeah.
Like just roll a die and hire them on a 6. Because like you said, you can study for the leak code thing, but I can tell you that I have not written a sort algorithm at work ever.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Like walking random paths, like, cool, I'm gonna go through this like neat give me like the lowest cost air flight to Cancun by pass, and it's like you're never gonna, come on, like, be serious. But we chatted a little bit before the show, there's you're right, there's like that, there's the like do a real thing. I think sometimes there's this like puzzle that's not like a trick, and I think there's like 2 different styles. Whiteboarding I find to be toxic, but there's somewhere in the middle that we're going to talk about in part 2, which is like, it's sort of contrived, but hopefully it at least gets problem solving, it gets talking through requirements, it gets that kind of stuff, which I think sometimes is the best you can do.
Yeah, I think this is what I've seen is kind of developing. The company I'm at now, Levels, did the same thing. The Home Chef, right, it has this philosophy where it's like, let's get you as close as possible to doing some type of real work, and doing it in a closed time box environment. It's like, we have 90 minutes, we're going to work through this, and set the expectation of like, we're not expecting you to get from point A to the end right in this time period, because our people probably didn't fix this in that time period, right? So it's like, this
exactly.
This is as close as we can get, and you're communicating, right? And I feel like that's the biggest part is like you're trying to see this realistic time set. I think maybe it takes a little bit more time for folks, right? If you're doing the standard leak code, we got 30 minutes, here's 1 question or 2 questions, and you're done, right?
That's so much pressure though, right? Like the cool thing about the you're not going to finish problems is I feel like people like explode with the pressure when you're like, you're going to have to do this by 60 minutes or you're not getting a job. And so you get into like 40 minutes, you're like, oh God, what am I doing? That's not how the job works, right? Or hopefully not. If your job actually works like that, like you got organizational problems to solve.
Reach out to Home Chef, right?
Reach out to Home Chef.
It's interesting. I don't know. I kind of like the leak code style stuff, but just because I know it's a thing that you can prepare for, right? And like, I also know fair. I got 30 minutes, and if I do well, I'm moving on. And if I don't, it's only 30 minutes of my time that I lost, right? Versus that's I spent fair. 6 hours on a project that they send me a form rejection letter.
Well, 6 hours is too many. 6 hours is too many for sure. I mean, I would say that your job at Levels is probably practice for that other style of interview. So, you're actually spending dozens of hours per week practicing for that style of interview.
I guess that's true. That's interesting. I didn't think about that. Cool. As far as technical interviews in the past, I guess, how do you feel you've done in technical interviews? Do you feel like, you love them, you hate them, somewhere in between?
I wouldn't say I like them, but I feel like I'm able to do quite well.
Mhm.
I think a surprising amount of that is just that I'm very gregarious and I'm happy to like talk out loud
Yeah.
and I'm willing to not know a thing. I think that people sometimes get trapped in like feeling like they can't have any ignorance in the interview,
Mm.
or getting, frustrated and stuck. I will just be like, I don't get it. Let's talk through this thing. Like, let's write it down. Let's figure it out. Let's ask questions. And I think that puts people at a positive frame of mind. And then I feel like I do well just from a purely coding standpoint. Fortunately, at this point, I've got so much history that I feel like I usually have some sort of analogy to whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, you mentioned earlier there's like this pressure, right? Of like, oh, I only have X amount of time left. Like, can I figure this out? But
Yeah.
I think the cure to that is being open to saying like, oh, I don't know this thing, right? Or like, huh,
Mhm.
I I don't know how to answer this whole problem, right? But at least let me take
Yeah.
this piece of it and try to work through that. And I think that's the
Yeah.
biggest realization I've come to is that yes, it'd be great if you could solve the problem, right? But if
Hmm.
you're not going to solve the problem, at least solve some part of it, right? And then you can show
Yeah.
you understand how to work through something. And I think that is often what interviews are looking for is like, show
Hmm.
me when you get to a difficult point and you don't have an immediate solution, what do you do from there,
Yeah.
right? And like,
How
what
do
is
you
your
think through
problem
that?
solving?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how do you hopefully verbalize it out loud? Because I'll say as
Yeah.
an interviewer, sometimes folks get to that point, they just get quiet for 10
Yeah.
minutes and like, I'm feeling awkward and they're feeling awkward.
Yeah.
I actually had a really, an interview that went really well. I was a candidate in this case where I ran out of time near the end. And there was a significant chunk left, and I basically was able to say like, I want to pause this and I want to talk through that part. I'm not going to be able to program it, but I want to have a discussion about what that other part looks like.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was received really well. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing often from folks who are on the show as well. There's I call it hand waving stuff away. I don't know if it's I got to find a
Sure.
better term for it, right? But that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're alluding to, right? Where you're saying I do not have time to do this thing, but
Mhm.
I if I had time, I could probably do this, or at least let me
Yeah.
show you I understand this, so we don't have to go super
Yeah.
deep into this, right?
Yeah. And there's usually some like, oftentimes there's like some trick or twists or something,
Yeah,
or like some part that's like the kernel of the difficult part of that, right? Because, if you're just implementing straight trivial stuff, it's maybe not a great interview. But
yeah,
yeah, so if you can say like identify the tough part and talk through sort of how you approach that, that's that same thing you're looking for in that earlier part. Like you
yeah.
understand it, you're willing to talk through it.
Great. Do you have any type of system? I think you mentioned kind of asking questions and calling out when you don't know something, but any
Yeah.
type of system you use to break down technical questions where maybe someone says, "Hey,
Hmm.
do X," and you're like, "I don't know if I know how to do X." Right?
Yeah, I mean, again, definitely calling it out, willing to be ignorant, willing to ask tons of questions. I think a lot of interviews, part of the intent is they want you to clarify a bunch of requirements.
Hmm.
In those cases, you can kind of hear it because you read the question prompt. You're like, okay, this is a little vague. I'll break that down. I tend to try to implement the stupidest version of whatever the thing is. Very fortunate to work in the Ruby community where you could just do stupid stuff with Ruby. But it's like the very basic case. And then, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna start with the dumb version to get somewhere.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about moving up into something smarter. Right. But I tell them this is not the code I would ship.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Do you have any advice or tips for folks who are going into technical interviews?
It's a lot of the things we talked about. I think hopefully if you're in a healthy company or a healthy interview, I think it's sometimes easy to forget. Like the interview wants you to do well. The interviewer feels very awkward when you're not doing well. So like they're rooting for you. And I try to express that with our candidates and say like I'm here to get you to show your best. Like I'm
Mhm.
not here to like trick you and make you feel bad. Like I'm here to like help you show off how good you are. And so like you can depend on me not like trying to, screw you over.
Yeah.
And I think that can sometimes help remove some of those nerves for folks, even if they don't say it, for you to remember that that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it just sets a tone, right? That is so much better in an interview, right? Especially if people are coming in with nerves and you're barely, hearing the interviewer's name, right? But if they at least say, "Hey, I'm here I'm here to try to help," right? At least it's one, maybe pulls back one layer of stress, right? Of like, okay, great, at least they're on my side. At least they're saying they're on my side.
Yeah, it's not you versus me. It's us, trying to figure out a thing together.
Yeah. I think that's the maybe I lean into this too much what I've interviewed in the past, but I'm trying to think of it as like having a conversation with the other person or like solving a problem with the other person rather than like they've asked me a question and now I'm expected to spit out this result, right? Like my goal is to let's have a conversation and almost like if we were working through this problem together, right? I say maybe I've leaned into that too much because I definitely had people tell me in the past like, oh, you ask a lot of questions, and I'm like, yeah, because I don't necessarily know the answer.
Is that bad? I mean, should I not be asking questions?
Yeah.
No, it's funny. We talk about technical interviews, right? And like the conceit of the interview is usually like you're going to code something, or I'm going to have you design an API or something like that. But yeah, I think having that conversation, like I think it leaves the other person feeling like they had a positive interaction. And frankly, most places don't have very formal scoring, and that person's going to score you higher because they liked interacting with you. Is that fair? I don't know. If we were talking about an ideal world, maybe not. But that is a reality we live in, and I want to get hired, so I'm gonna be friendly.
Yeah, I've said before, hiring is a game of inches sometimes, right? Where you just have to be kind of 1 inch or one step ahead of whoever the other person on the list is, right? And I don't know.
You don't have to be faster than the bear, right?
Yeah, right. Right. I think I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily fair, but I don't think I would have a job as an engineer if I had not been able to make a connection right early on. And then at least I've got something pulling me through when I do high on person-to-person communication and mediocre at technical. At least I'm probably getting past through it, right?
Your theater background, right?
Yeah.
Which there's sort of an inverse of that, right? Which like some people, like they hear that and they're very shy, or they get a lot of nerves, right? And like that's part of why you try to reduce folks' nerves. But like if you're a shy person and you struggle to communicate, like I think that's the biggest hurdle that a lot of those folks hit, because they may be quite good, but then they get, they tense up and they have a difficult time with that communication. I think that's why mock interviews are great, because it gives you a chance to, kind of do it until it's boring and not some like exceptional wrought up circumstance.
We were talking before the show about, hating watching stuff you've done in the past, right? Or like hearing your own voice. I think it is a similar thing where you can train yourself to get used to it if you just force yourself to get through it enough times. Same thing with mock interviews, where like it's this like immediate fear response, but if you expose yourself to it enough times, then it does lessen, at least to some extent. Maybe you're never going to be like, steady pulse the entire time.
Exactly.
But
I mean, interviews are stressful, like for anybody. So you're never going to totally get away from it. But yeah, you're inoculated against the stress, right?
Yeah. Pull it down from 120 beats per minute to 80, and hopefully, it won't be as bad.
Yeah, exactly.
I had a question around, you mentioned earlier, basically, if you get a vague question and you recognize like, oh, maybe they're expecting me to kind of put some of the parameters in place, right? Or ask questions around these. Do you tend to ask it in a question form or more state something where like, oh, okay, well, let's assume that these are all going to be arrays, and this is always going to have integers in it. I'm never going to have an empty array, right? So I don't have to even check for that. Or are you asking questions in the form of, okay, can I assume that this would be the case, or will I ever have empty arrays?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It feels a little bit situational, right? If you when you get a prompt, right? Like, when you start with the prompt, I feel like this is the first big opportunity where you sort of identify what do you mean when you say X?
Mhm.
When we talk about this, are we getting consistent input? Are we getting it as an array? Sometimes I think when you're in the middle of coding, that's your opportunity to sort of like identify that and hand wave it, kind of as you said,
Mhm. Yeah,
like drop a little comment in and be like, this isn't going to work if there's a nil at the end of the array.
sure.
And
Yeah,
we'll come back to that, but I want to get through this thing. We'll come back to that other case, where it's maybe a little bit more declarative than a question. But
yeah,
a question pulls in the interviewer, right? It means the interviewer gets to participate.
yeah, yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, I've heard it both ways, and it's always interesting to me. I always feel super aggressive, and I'm like, there's never going to be a negative, number in this array, and I'm like, I guess, I guess they'll tell me different if
I
there
guess
will
not.
be.
Yeah, I'm
Interesting.
not sure I would receive that poorly. I mean,
Yeah,
unless you made some like super, you're like, unless you like got rid of the part that is supposed to be hard, right?
sure.
You're like, I'm going to assume all the inputs are trivial. You're
Yeah,
like, well, but they're not. I would
it's
tell
going to
you that.
return true by default, right? Like this is always going to
Yeah.
be easy. Yeah,
Maybe you could say
uh,
like, all right, to start, I'm going to assume, you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
at this level, I'm going to make this assumption. You've called out that
hmm
you have identified an issue. You haven't really precluded it moving beyond that or you solving for that problem. I don't
yeah,
know. Maybe that would be, I feel like that would be effective.
yeah. I actually like that. Like to start, I'll assume this, and then again, I think the benefit of making the statement is they'll probably tell you otherwise if
Sure.
they
Yeah.
want you to solve for whatever that thing is.
Yeah.
And then you're not having to spend time asking the question. At least they'll note that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like, oh, interesting, and then maybe
Mm-hmm.
they'll ask you at the end, right? I think that's often
Yeah.
where things go. Is like you may, even if you ask that question ahead of time, they'll be like, oh yeah, you don't have to worry about that. And then you get to the end and
Yeah.
they go, okay, great. Now what would this look like if you did have to worry about that thing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
So
there's whenever you see a rubric, so a lot of interviews have a grading rubric. So
yeah.
here's your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like a lot of what you see on those rubrics is like they mentioned input validation. They found X bug or issue.
Mhm.
And it's checkmarky, right? Because if you're gonna have a grading rubric, in a sense, you end up being very checkmarkish.
Yeah.
So even calling those out, sometimes you can like rack that check mark up, even if you don't go back and solve it immediately.
Yeah. Do you have different advice, or maybe additional advice for early career engineers? Maybe people who are going into their first job search, and maybe they got 6 months to a year of
Yeah,
experience, kind of looking.
sure. I'd say the first one is the interesting one because you don't have proof, right?
Mm.
We talked about those early first contracting gigs. I as a hiring manager, if I've got somebody who's in the very beginning, I need to like have some kind of proof that they know something, right? And so your goal is like no red flags. I will not do anything red flaggish, and I will like demonstrate to this person, right? Like how do I get this person to understand that like I do know how to do this thing? I
Mm.
promise.
Yeah.
Which is one of the cool things about boot camps, right? Is you get that portfolio. But yeah,
Yeah. I think that's
um,
the biggest thing I've seen from boot camp graduates is like, do you have something you can show at the end, right? And like,
yeah,
at least that gets your foot in the door.
yeah,
Hopefully, you
yeah,
can show some complexity of it. But even if it's just something that you're not super proud of that project, at least if you have something, right, that's helpful.
yeah, absolutely. Well, so there are a lot of career switchers nowadays, right?
Mm.
The number of like jazz musicians that I've known who are now programmers is like way more significant than I would have anticipated.
Yeah.
But another thing that you can do that I try to express, when I went to Dev Bootcamp to help folks out is do not hide or throw away that experience. That
Mm.
experience is valuable, right? Like being able to say, in my former job, I had to, break down things, or I had to, pay attention to what people wanted, like whatever you can pull out of that. I again, as the interviewer now get to feel like, yeah, they have that skill, maybe really well developed. Like those things are a strength, not a drawback.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to, when I was working at actualize a coding boot camp, I used to tell folks like you may score kind of here on their technical standards, right? But that's probably where they're expecting you to come in at, right? But where you're going to shine is that you come in here, some other business thing that maybe a computer science graduate isn't going to have, right? Like a 21-year-old who's this is their first job, maybe they're going to be a little bit soft on their ability to, just show up to work on time, right? Versus like, I've been a professional for 15 years or 10 years. Like, okay, you have something that you can show you understand, wearing a collared shirt on maturity,
teamwork, collaboration. Also like CS, I think maybe there's a perception that CS grads come out like knowing a lot about writing code, frankly. Computer science degrees do an awful job teaching people to be like day-to-day professional engineers. So you should never feel like the CS kids are coming out, coming out swinging 4 years into their career. They also need to learn all that stuff. Yeah.
Having worked with now interns and a good chunk of basically just computer science graduates and being a bootcamp graduate myself now, I feel like SQL is weirdly strong with computer science graduates. They always come out really understanding SQL, and maybe it's just because I don't understand, like I'm just barely getting by, and they're like, oh, we got to use a right join here, and I'm like, whatever you say, intern, like let's do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That might be one where the having the sort of theoretical underpinning is maybe a little bit more helpful, because SQL is essentially an algebra of sorts. I had like 2 databases classes in college, so you may be right that that's probably one of the ones where they come out a little stronger. But ask them to use Git. They never done it.
Yeah, right. Even CSS, I'm like, oh, my SQL deficiencies are, kind of made up by the fact that I understand how to make a page look nice, right? Versus, how do we do this class, right? I'm like, great. Like now I got something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Before we, take a break and then move into the technical portion, do you have any interviewing horror stories that you're willing to share that maybe people can relate to think, oh, it's not so bad. It could even happen to Joe.
I've got one from being the interviewer that I think you had Jeff Miller on the show previously. Which is funny because I think he tells this story too, where I interviewed him and then I told him no. And I'm like, nah, this guy, he's not into it. He's not really, he's not really showing any of the things I want him to show, like pass. And then he came back and he's like, you're wrong. And I'm going to prove to you that you're wrong. And I ended up giving him a chance anyway. And he turned out to be a fantastic engineer. And I think in that sense, like that very much demonstrates that hiring is guessing in a lot of ways. If you're not doing well in an interview, or if you do get passed on, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have been great for the role. Frankly, it doesn't mean anything about you. Hiring's hard. Folks are bad at it. I'd say on the interviewee side, my very first interview at the library job, I thought I bombed. I left that interview and I called a friend and I'm like, well, on to the next one. and they ended up hiring me, which is sort of the inverse of that. Is like, you may be doing better than you thought. I didn't understand back then that my job was not to like have all the right answers. And so they kept asking me these questions. I'm like, one of them, I was literally like, what is the answer? After we moved on, I'm like, what was the answer to that last question? But so you may be doing better than you think you are. So like, don't be like, well, I didn't know the answer, so I'm going to stop, give up. Yeah. Because you never know.
I mean, that might be a plus for some interviews, right? Or if you don't know the answer at all, and then you actually ask afterwards, like, can I teach me something, right?
Yeah. Which I did. I had given up. I'm like, all right, well, I've already lost. And so I'm like, whatever, I'll learn something new while I'm at it. But yeah, apparently that had been a strong positive in my favor. It's inquisitiveness, curiosity. Yeah. Right. It's something that they valued. So I was able to accidentally demonstrate inquisitiveness.
That's really funny. So I just said Veronica Butron she's the CEO of Tango Code on a couple of weeks ago, and she's a very similar story. Basically, she kind of interned for a company and just absolutely bombed, right? And just she was like, I didn't even know what they were talking about, right? And clearly they knew I didn't know what they were talking about, right?
Sure.
But she said, they still gave me a job offer. Obviously, I took it because I was like, I don't think based off of that anything else is coming, right?
Fooled you.
Yeah. She said I had a conversation with them years and years later, right? Like the same person interviewing, like, why did you hire me then? Right? Like we're far enough away from it. I've proven that you shouldn't fire me at this point, right? But like, why would you hire me? And they said, oh, you asked questions, and even though you didn't know this thing, I could tell you cared, right? Like you actually were interested in learning the answers, right? And like that stands out. And the more I think about interviewing, the more it's not like you have to get the right answer to whatever arbitrary problem you've been given. It's can you basically work to something and show that process along the way, right? And really the crux of the problem, that's what and what you do when you hit that part you don't know how to solve, that is the interview, right? And that's what is actually being tested, not do you know how to find the first duplicate in this array, right?
I mean, if they have an interview question, you just blow through it. Like, do that. Still narrate, but if it's all right to be confident through the problem. But one way I explained it once to some apprentices was, if you're junior, you're going to either come in here, and you kind of said, right, you're going to come in here, you're going to come in here. It's still like way less than whatever my level is for a senior person. So it's not where you are; it's your trajectory, right? I want somebody who's on this trajectory, not this trajectory.
Yeah.
And that curiosity is what gets you here. The asking questions, the, being able to communicate problems, that sort of stuff is what tells me you're going to move fast, get stronger faster. Giving up or, some of these other like negative behaviors are red flags because it says to me you're not going to get better faster.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to tell our bootcamp graduates, they're not hiring you for your technical skills day one, right? Or even the employee you're going to be day one. They're hiring you for, day 6 months in or 365, right? Like it's
like growth, right? Yeah.
It's going to be a drastic difference from those 2 points. And it's like, what does that look like, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's take a break and then we'll come back and move into the technical portion.
Sounds good.
Thank you for watching the first half of the Professional Technical Interviewee. The technical interview will be released 1 week from this episode, so be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing. Hey, how are you?
Doing well. Video.
Good. Thanks for taking the time. Is that your place?
This is my home, yeah.
That's great.
I've got you can tell I'm from Chicago.
Sure, yeah.
Plants that I haven't killed yet.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. That's cool. Where are you at in Chicago?
Wait, I'm gonna turn these lights off.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm in Logan Square.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Let's see if that's not.
We're bouncing around a bunch right now, so I'm in Maine. So I've got the
cool
thing, rocking chair and decor I did not choose, but
it's so much brighter than mine with the both the light and the white couch. I would never have the confidence to have a couch that color.
Yeah, I got bad like dust mite allergies, so we go to these places and it's like a toss up of if I sit on the couch and immediately start sneezing and I'm like, well, I guess I don't have a couch for the rest of the month, or if things are okay. And this one is not nice to me.
Oh no, sorry to hear that. Sorry,
it's all right. Great.
Any my other monitor is lighting.
Yeah.
Questions? I don't think so. I guess I'm interested to know when these typically get posted.
I was like a month and a half out, like basically it delayed from recording. I think it's actually a little bit longer now, mostly because I'm trying to take December off. So I'm not posting episodes in December. But there's I think this will be like the third month of next year, which feels really far out, but
that's all right.
that would
I'll be excited and or embarrassed of however it turns out 6 months from now.
Barely remember, right? It'd be like a dream.
I have an awful time watching anything of my own stuff.
Oh, really?
It's the worst to me because I'm always like, oh my God, I'm so awkward.
I used to feel like that, and I hated the sound of my own voice too. And then I started I was a theater major and I was doing improv in college. So I would do all the notes for our shows. Like I would rewatch them afterwards and then give notes for everyone and myself. And it was like the weirdest thing where not only did I have to hear my own voice and like see myself, I also had to hear myself improvising, which is just like the lowest of the low. So I think it got me through most of the cringe of hating that. So
that's really funny.
I just think of it as past me. That's a different guy. Like I don't have to associate with everything that guy said.
I remember I saw somebody recently who was like watching a thing that they did like 8 years ago, and they're like, I'm in my mid-30s. I'm immune to cringe. It's like, I'm not the person who recorded that anymore and haven't been for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't know how much I'll change in the next 6 months, but
there's a podcast it was like the week I graduated college and was leaving South Carolina to move to Chicago. And my brother just happened to be in the room when we were recording it. So he found it the other day and sent it to me. And I listened to the whole thing. And I was like, man, that is a time capsule of a very specific point of my life, right? Like peak like confidence of leaving college, hadn't yet become like a working adult. But it was just like a perspective that I can't relate to at all now, but it's interesting that I felt that way.